Fate, Souls and Singularities by Mundatorem Chapter 47 to 48. Chapter 47. By the Bonfire. 3. By the Bonfire. Growth in Cooking. He breathed life into himself as he materialized. The summoning completed, feeling flooding through his body. He could tell it was a servant summoning rather than his usual conditions. That much was expected, he was also somewhat grateful for it. Steel gray eyes opened, staring down at the pair in front of him, and the red-haired woman stood off to the side of the room. The dark-haired young boy was his master, he could feel the link with them. However, he had yet to acknowledge them. Were they kind? Were they cruel? Cold-hearted? Who were they as a master? What ideals did they strive for? And why was there a wolf the size of a horse poking its head through the entrance to the room? His alarm must have showed because the red-haired woman dressed in rather revealing simple white clothes and knee-high leather boots looked at him before turning around. Then letting out a short gasp of surprise and tensing herself. Sif. The boy cried, jolting and putting a hand over their heart. Don't do that. He exhaled, shaking his head. How do you move around so quietly? The wolf simply stared at the boy for a few moments before it snorted at him, taking one final look at the pair and then turning away from them. Soon strolling past the doorway and away from the entrance. The boy sighed, I swear, are we sure he doesn't have presence concealment? He joked at the lilac-haired girl. She smiled in amusement and released a small giggle in response. No senpai. I think Sif-san is just naturally quiet. Sei replied, before she frowned. Although I am surprised he was here, he usually stays near Andre-san's forge. Probably got shooed away. The boy gave a mirthful answer, he's always complaining about him. They seem to have history. I had history with my neighborhood cat. He snorted, that doesn't mean I'd want it showing up here. Really? The girl blinked, did you not like them? Oh no. I did like them quite a bit. He replied with a wave of his hand, it's just that, he was greedy. Very, very greedy. Also liked to sleep in weird places, and then just get in your face all the time. Excuse me. The woman stepped forwards, a somewhat bemused look on her face. I should probably introduce myself. I'm Ryder. She sent a glance his way, and a thoughtful frown to go along with the cursory look. Are we all on the same side? That depends. He answered coolly, soon looking to the boy for his answer. The young man blinked in surprise before making a slight noise of realization. Ah, sorry. Sif sort of interrupted us, didn't he? He scratched the back of his neck, giving the pair a welcoming smile. I'm Fujimaru Ritsuka, this is Mash Kairilight. And yeah, we're all on the same side. Ah, that's good then. The woman smiled. I'm Boudica. Mash blinked at her and then gaped. Ritsuka looked slightly puzzled for a few moments, still raking his brain. Boudica, he muttered to himself. The woman made to speak before he held up his hand politely. No, no. I got it. I know this one. British Queen. He hazarded a guess. Boudica looked at him with amusement, soon releasing a chuckle before she shook her head. Queen of the Iceni. She explained, although we were in Britain, so I suppose if you were to apply modern terminology I would be a Queen of Britain. I was close at least. The boy shrugged, although there was a slight glimmer of pride in his eyes at his guess, he then turned to him expectantly. Archer. The way his face fell and Boudica stared at him in obvious disappointment almost made him smirk. He settled for a slight twitch of his lips instead. Personal preference, you wouldn't have heard of me anyway. It would give us something to call you. Boudica explained with slightly narrowed eyes, and it would be more polite than just a class title. He shrugged, placing his left hand on his hips and leaning to the side slightly, maybe, but I'm quite content with a class title for now, although we'll see if that changes in the future. So you'll tell us, Archer-san? Mash asked. She looked so innocent it was almost blinding to him. Quote. Maybe. Archer shrugged. We'll see. He stepped off the summoning pad and looked around the room. So. The throne has already filled me in on the situation. He stared at the pair of them appraising Ly, more focused on the boy to measure his reaction. He gave no indication, a good sign thus far. It meant he understood the stakes at least. Anything else I should be aware of? What was with the wolf? Boudica asked the pair, looking genuinely interested. I didn't think that there were too many beasts like that in the modern era. Archer blinked and realized he had completely overlooked the monstrous beast. His eyes turned back to the pair and narrowed inquisitively, awaiting an answer. The boy, Ritska, winced in response before letting out a nervous chuckle. He, so. How much do you guys know about parallel universes? Archer could feel the headache approaching him already. More servants then. Olga spoke as she filed through the reports, having thrown herself into her work the second she had gotten back. Ash raised an eyebrow at the question. She should have already been aware considering that Ritska had to receive permission from her first, but soon nodded his head, yes. Ritska is taking them on a tour and explaining the current, cross-world situation. Olga groaned at that. Quote. Where are they from? Well, the woman calls herself Boudica. Olga let out a sigh of relief at that, clearly recognizing the name. It likely meant that the writer was of this world, considering he himself didn't know the name. The man though. He simply calls himself Archer. Why? He apparently didn't want to give his name. He's a servant. She dryly replied, his wants shouldn't factor into it, unless he Achilles or Siegfried, his name should be one of the first things out of his lips. Or it doesn't matter. Ash pointed out, or he knew he wouldn't be recognized. That would make him quite useless. She saw Ash frown at her before rolling her eyes. The older the myth, and the more well-known it is, the greater the heroic spirit summoned. Although there are a few exceptions to this, but that is typically the manner in which summonings work. For example, King Gilgamesh of Uruk would undoubtedly be the strongest heroic spirit because of the age of his legend. How old is it? 5,000 years, why? She asked, then could see the look on Ash's face before she huffed, really? I know that the god we currently have running around is older, but that just proves my point in power being linked to age, does it not? I did kill Aldrich in life. Ash pointed out, and several other gods. None of you were servants at the time. She flicked through the another report. Anything else? Not that I know of. Ash replied after a few moments, although there have been several more complaints about Havel. TCH. She clicked her tongue. Should use a command seal and simply get him to behave. Would you use a command seal on a man who despises mages and could actively destroy magical spells? Quote. Still needs to be better controlled. I'm glad you think so. Ash joked, standing up from his seat. When we have servant who can do so, be sure to let me know. Olga sent a challenging smirk his way. What about all those gods you killed? Afraid of a berserker are we? You were the one talking about age equaling power. Ash pointed out with a cool smile in response. I'm afraid I'm a servant now and Havel is older than me, there is simply nothing I can do. He got a deadpan expression in response. Why do you even come here? Because otherwise you'd be by yourself. Ash replied, and it's either myself who comes here or see you. I could just have Berserker keep you out. She pointed out wryly, he's probably stronger than you. Quote. Fair enough. He shrugged in response. No name for them yet. They're a giant suit of armor. Olga rolled her eyes, they don't even have a personality. Astolfo would disagree. He would disagree with me that the sky existed. She snarked. That's what evaporation of reason does. He's a berserker in the class of a rider. Does it make him wrong? I'm not debating this. Berserker is a familiar, not a house cat. Cat is a good name. Get out. No. What about bird? Berserker. She called out. Ash released a small chuckle and moved to the door as the giant servant opened it up. I'm not giving them a name. She called out to him as the door closed. So, Sigward clapped his hands together as he looked at the pair in front of him, grinning from ear to ear and radiating positivity. I am here to see if your cooking skills slap. Archer blinked at him. If they what? Did I not say it right? Sigward asked, looking genuinely troubled. He soon cupped his chin and hummed. I did it as Astolfo said, hem. Maybe it's the delivery. He nodded to himself, then looked at the pair seriously. Art thy skills in the art of cooking bitchin'? Archer and Boudica remained silent for a few moments, then the latter's lips started to twitch. The woman soon holding her hand in front of her mouth to hide her smile and looking away from the man, a choked laugh bubbling up in her throat. He wasn't entirely sure how to react himself. The straight delivery of the bizarre sentence told him that this Sigward was being entirely serious. But this was a man who was apparently a knight who dressed like an onion from a world across the kaleidoscope, and here he was failing at slang. Archer wasn't even sure which reaction was justified in this situation. Sigurd was still frowning at them following the reaction. His mystified expression only solidified in his mind that the servant had absolutely no idea what the problem was. No. The man soon looked away from them in thought before he snapped his fingers. Ah. Perhaps it is because you have only just arrived here. I'm sure that is simply it. He looked around the cafeteria and spotted something at the door as Archer heard it open behind it. Ah. Sigurd let out a pleased noise, soon back to his smiling expression. See you. What's crackin', you old dog? The fuck? Archer had a much harder time composing his expression. He turned around and saw the Irish lancer looking taken off guard at the statement, an expression mixed between genuine anger at being called a dog and bafflement at the person who called him that. The hell are you? The lancer trailed off when he caught sight of Archer. His expression soon morphed into a scowl and he leveled a finger in his direction. Not a peep out of you, prick. I know you want to say something. Really? Archer blinked in faux surprise. I'm just waiting for you to answer his question. He responded innocently before smirking in his direction. So what is crackin', you old dog? Fuck you. See you, spat back, eye twitching before he looked past him to Boudica, his expression doing a complete 180 from disgust to pleased. Well, finally getting someone nice to look at. He cheered. Anne is nice, but she isn't that well developed yet. And the shield girl is probably spoken for soon. He laughed at a hidden joke. So. Who are you? Boudica. The woman crossed her arms, leaning on the countertop and raising an amused eyebrow in the lancer's direction. Rider. See you smirked at her. See you Chilane, Lan. Guard dog. Archer cut him off, then seemingly smirked. Although considering there is an actual wolf here, are you not out of the job? The lancer twitched. You little. Then Roland sprinted around the naked for weeks. Came a muffled cheery voice from behind the lancer. The door behind his servant opened again and Archer found himself frowning as a literal walking rock ducked underneath the top of the door and walked into the cafeteria, a small pink-haired boy skipping along at his side, barely making up to his chest. I'll tell you something. That was a disaster. Quote. Great. The giant armored man grunted in response, somewhat dismissively, but didn't move to interrupt the boy before he stared at the two new arrivals. Ma. Jess. He called out to them, questioning. He saw the lancer tense slightly. I'm a rider. Boudica offered. I don't use magic. That seemingly earned a small nod from the giant before it turned its head towards him. Archer. He offered. The giant grunted and walked towards the countertop while Sigurd readied himself. So, what do you wish to eat today, Havel? Sigurd asked, doing his best to appear cordial. Although Archer could see the slight hint of apprehension in his eyes, he noticed a similar state of Cu Chilane. The lancer looked relaxed, but his form was slightly tensed. As if he were expecting the need to fight at any second. Archer furrowed his brows and looked at the large servant. Apparently there were some issues already. The servant stared at the menu for a few moments before he looked back at Sigurd. Beef, and said no more, earning a slight sigh from Sigurd and an incredulous look from Archer. All right. Sigurd nodded his head. Havel grunted and soon moved away to an empty section of the room and sat down at a table. The chair groaned as he lowered himself into it and Archer found himself wondering how it didn't immediately break under the weight of the servant. Well, as for you two, he found his attention back on Sigurd. Julius is the head chef of the kitchen, so you will need to ask him if you wish to help. He'll be here soon, the lunch rush will be upon us. Archer could imagine, especially if their requests were all as vague as the stone-armored man. And you, Astolfo? Sigurd asked the boy, what will you have? Can I get some salmon? The boy cheered, make it extra creamy too. That white stuff is just the best. Quote. I see. Sigurd scratched his brow and nodded his head. Creamy salmon. It came as no surprise that Julius had accepted the help of the pair the second he found out they could actually work their way around a kitchen. The man was actually incredibly relieved that their staff in the kitchen was getting larger and the servants were actually capable of making good food. Archer had been made aware of a certain berserker who could cook as well, but she only did so for the master and no one else. Not exactly useful for the rest of the Chaldea staff. However, the presence of more cooks, even if they weren't official in life, was a boon. How come you don't taste your food as you cook it? Boudica asked him. Sigurd paused as he stirred the pot before he released an almost hollow laugh. I'm afraid it wouldn't do much good. He replied back to her, taking the spoon out of the stew and tapping the excess off the surface before grabbing a bowl. Unkindled like myself cannot taste anything, or feel very much for that matter. Except pain, that still works. Archer grimaced. That wasn't very good, and you still cook despite that. Well, I cooked for many years, started off as a hobby. Sigurd replied, handing the bowl of stew to the member of staff, but I found myself doing it more and eventually just got better. Even picked up recipes as I traveled, that was most enjoyable. Learning all sorts of new dishes to make before I went off and cooked them. And now, Archer found himself asking. Sigurd paused for a few moments. A slightly uncomfortable expression passed across his face before he slowly gave a tiny smile towards the tanned man. Now I simply cook because despite everything, I am still good at it, even if its taste can't bring a smile to my face, it can at least bring one to someone else's. That's really nice of you. Boudica smiled at him, and to keep cooking without being able to taste probably means you're quite talented. I try. Sigurd shrugged. There were always a few recipes I couldn't get right though, namely fish. I wondered why you looked a little nervous when the girl. Boy. Sigurd corrected. At her surprised look he gave a knowing smile. Yes, it confused us all greatly at first, except Lord Gwyndolin. He shrugged at that, although that might be because he is rather much the same. Who? Archer asked, looking around the cafeteria. You won't find him. Sigurd sighed. He doesn't leave his room much, very isolated. Only comes out during the hours of the night and even then, he doesn't eat. I suspect it is because he is the only god here. Archer almost dropped the plate he was holding, snapping his neck to the man so quickly he almost gave himself whiplash. The only what? Sigurd blinked at the pair. You didn't know. How odd. Gwyndolin is the god of the dark moon. He offered, he came back with us after they returned from Rome. Something shattered. Archer and Sigurd looked to see Boudica with her hand clenched into a fist. The remains of a mug at her feet, having obviously been crushed by her grip. Archer knew why she had made the sudden turn. Of course, anyone who knew of her history would have probably avoided the topic being mentioned to her face. Unfortunately Sigurd wasn't as aware. His eyes looked at her in worry and then to the remains at her feet before back to her. Are you all right, my dear? Boudica blinked, then looked down at the shards at her feet before releasing a weighty sigh. Sorry. Look at me getting all clumsy. Soon looking up, she saw Sigurd still staring at her with concern in his blue eyes. She waved her hand at him. I'm fine, don't worry. I'll clean this up. Sorry again about making a mess. Oh, it's quite alright. Sigurd nodded, not looking entirely convinced before a smile came to his face, although it wasn't as overtly positive as before. I'm used to being clumsy. I once fell asleep in my armor and awoke to find myself naked. Despite herself, Boudica released a snort and sent a disbelieving look in the Onion Knight's direction. Surely not. I'm afraid it's quite true. He nodded morosely. I hid in a well to hide away my shame. Were you drugged? Archer asked, moving over to the stove and grabbing a pan to make the next order. Sigurd chuckled nervously, scratching the back of his head and looking away from the pair. It would have been less embarrassing if that were the case. He gave a hapless shrug towards them, his smile jovial and a little self-depreciating. I'm afraid I'm quite the heavy sleeper. Must have been. Archer mused as he went to work cooking. It was odd for him. He'd only opted to help in the kitchen because they were so understaffed and it felt better than doing nothing. However, everything was far too tranquil. Even the berserker, Havel, being in the room did little to dampen everyone's spirits. It was jarring for him. Although that didn't stop the Lancer from glaring at him from across the room, their face still kept in a scowl. Archer smirked at them in response, almost tauntingly. Lancer looked ready to vault the table and rush him. If it weren't for the saber in blue armor with the white furred collar he very much suspected the Lancer would have. It seemed that some things never quite changed, no matter where he found himself. She seemed troubled. He heard a muttered whisper near him, looking down to see Sigurd with his brows furrowed and a slight frown on his face. Archer knew what he was talking about. Boudica's reaction had been far from private. However, it's a personal matter for her, he replied to the man, earning a look from the corner of his eye and a tilt of the head to show they were paying attention, likely to do with your mention of Rome. Sigurd hummed in response, a thoughtful look on his face before he nodded his head. I see, troubled past. I do hope I didn't drag up any unfortunate memories for her. Whether or not you did doesn't matter too much. Archer responded and he turned back to the pan, putting a dab of cooking oil in it and preparing the cuts of meat. If she's smart, she'll be able to restrain herself. That would depend on how deeply it affects her. Sigurd responded to him, a slight hint of disapproval at the dismissal of her concerns in his tone, but it wasn't approaching a full scolding just yet. From what he had seen of the man thus far, Archer wasn't entirely sure that this Sigurd was capable of any negative emotions. We all have our own demons. HMPH. Archer grunted in response. I don't deny that, but the stakes are too high to be worrying about them. Is that so? He hummed in reply. It could also be argued that it is better to deal with the issues as soon as possible. And if it ends the way you don't want. Archer replied, looking at Sigurd out of the corner of his eye. The man was still for a few moments before he replied. An end to the issue, no matter the ending, still puts the matter to rest. His voice sounded distant. Even if it hurts, the matter would have been resolved and can be put behind you. Wise words. Archer acknowledged. However, most people can't usually put such personal matters behind them once they have confronted them. It might just get worse if it is resolved in a way they dislike, and in our current situation that could prove most troublesome. Perhaps it is my nature as unkindled talking. Sigurd released a small chuckle which didn't sound entirely mirthful. When the threat of hollowing forever looms over you, many are in a rush to conclude any lingering woes before they lose themselves entirely. And yourself. And myself. Sigurd nodded. Although I was able to complete my final duty, in the end, it wasn't how I wished it ended. But it was an end regardless. He turned to face him, his expression downcast. I will not force her into an outcome if she does not wish it, but I will offer my advice to her should the matter continue. Archer shrugged in response. I was simply offering my own advice. He dropped the meat into the pan and started to stir it as it sizzled away. You don't need my permission to do anything. No. But sage advice is always welcome. Sigurd replied, and I feel as though you two have a history on personal issues. Archer's hand froze. Do not concern yourself, I will not pry either. Although names can mean everything to unkindled, they can sometimes be what separates us from hollows. I only ask that you consider the matter closely before you debate whether or not hiding away your own is truly the best course of action for you. Archer remained silent, simply continuing on in the cooking. Sigurd, likewise, didn't continue the line of conversation which led to a silence that pervaded throughout the kitchen until Boudica's return. Dustpan and brush in hand, the writer stared at the silent pair in slight confusion for a few moments before she shrugged and swept up the broken pieces of mug. Hey, Sigurd. A voice called out to them. The aforementioned knight looked up to see Romani approaching them with a carefree smile. Can I ask you something? Of course. The man responded with a jovial smile. What can I do for you? Well, the Moon Festival is coming up soon and I was kinda hoping you would be able to make something special. Moon Festival. Sigurd blinked. The only Moon Festival I am aware of is Gwyndolin's birthday. I believe he refers to the end of summer. Archer piped up from where he was cooking, although I wasn't aware it was so close. Romani looked behind Sigurd to the new arrivals. Ah. You must be the recently summoned servants, right? I'm Romani Archaman, but everyone calls me Roman. He introduced himself with a smile. Boudica looked him up and down before she shook her head and looked away. Probably don't want me to call you Roman. Huh. She's Boudica. Archer pointed out. The man slowly paled and looked away. Soon releasing a nervous chuckle and not quite looking in her direction. Ah. Haha, alright. He coughed into his hand, looking to Archer for an introduction. Archer. Okay. He whispered to himself before turning back to Sigurd. Anyway, I was hoping that we'd be able to use the festival to give the staff a bit of a break and a little time for relaxation. Sounds like a splendid idea. Sigurd exclaimed, leaning forwards on the countertop. Why, I could probably make up something special. Well, I was hoping you would be able to make dumplings. Dumplings. Sigurd repeated the word in slight confusion. What are dumplings? Small treats made of dough with a vegetable filling in them. Archer supplied, although I doubt you would have heard of them. From what you say, your style of cooking is mostly European. I assume that is a kingdom of sorts. Something like that. Archer shrugged, then turned to Romani with a somewhat thoughtful expression. Have you run this idea by the boy yet? Well, I was probably going to do that next. Romani replied, then cringed. First I was going to have to run it by the director. I wonder if Ash could do it for me. I do not believe he is as safe from her moments of anger as you believe. Sigurd pointed out. Romani blinked at him before giving a small smile in response. No, but he's a lot more durable than I am. He boasted, earning a flat look from everyone in the kitchen before Sigurd shook his head and looked to the two servants in the kitchen with him. Well, as long as you can get permission. He replied thoughtfully, then looked at Archer. I don't suppose you would be willing to teach me to make these dumplings, would you? I've got no problems with it. Archer replied, however it's more about ability, considering you can't taste test your food. It is not the first time I have made a new dish, I'll have you know. Sigurd chuckled. I made many a meal when I was still undead before I became an unkindled. I shall be most capable of making this small doughy ball. Archer couldn't help but curl his lips slightly at the man's enthusiasm about making fried treats. Something that Boudica had far less willingness to demonstrate, her earlier issues seemingly forgotten as she fully grinned at the man. Never tried making dumplings before either. She admitted with a hum, I suppose I'll give it a go as well, considering it might end up being a festival. Nothing like the spirit of jolly cooperation to bring people from different walks of life together. Sigurd exclaimed, although we may not be tackling a giant or a demon of the old chaos, we shall face this obstacle with equal grit and valor. Yeah. The trio turned to see Astolfo with his hand thrust into the air in a victorious pose. The writer blinked at them for a few seconds before he lowered the arm and let out a nervous chuckle. Sorry. You sounded so excited that I had to rush over and chime in. So what are you guys talking about? It seems there is a festival of the moon fast approaching. The moon. Astolfo grinned. I once flew to the moon. I lost my sanity, but it comes back every full moon. Quite so. I wonder if Linny is going to be taking part. Astolfo hummed in thought, cupping their chin as they gave a thoughtful expression. They are a god of the moon after all. He turned around and faced the cafeteria. Hey Rocky. R.O. Ski. Havel growled in confusion, looking up from his plate and towards them. Disturbingly, the man hadn't removed his helmet to eat. Simply pushing the scraps of meat he cut off through the vents in his helmet. Which was rather unhygienic and had Archer frowned slightly as he saw visible stains of sauce running down the outside of the mont's armor. Sorry. I can't remember your name. Astolfo shouted back in reply, has Linny ever had a moon festival? Lin, N.Y. Havel tilted his head. Oh, H. Gwyn, do, Lin, they nodded to themselves in understanding. H. Ad, Bert, H-Day, on, C.E. E.H. Astolfo blinked, once. A frown soon came to the boy's face as he put his hands on his hips and leaned forwards. What about all the other times? I, only, ended. 1, Havel replied back after a few moments. Wa, S, A, war, on, he explained before he pushed another cut of meat through the porthole in his helmet, the cut disappearing into the black void and was soon followed by chewing noises and a loud swallowing sound. I'm now trying to picture a god having a birthday celebration. Boudica hummed to herself in thought as she looked up. I don't think it was much like the Iceni. How did they do it? Sigurd asked. Boudica blinked at him before answering. Normally a big feast, followed by a brawl. She sighed, honestly, I love them but sometimes we really were a bunch of children. Somehow, I do not believe that Havel would have much an issue. Sigurd joked, throwing a thumb over at the stone-armored man, and I doubt we could have many who could contest his physical strength, perhaps the living armor, but that is it. Living suit of armor. Archer raised an eyebrow. You mean a golem? Ah, that is what Lady Olga called it as well. Sigurd nodded his head, although it feels terribly rude to just call them berserker, or a thing. I feel like giving them a name. We giving the big guy a name? Astolfo asked, a giddy expression on his face which looked fit to burst, because I've been stocking up on them ever since I found out they don't have one. I've got a big list of names just ready to use. Oh. Sigurd, then examine this list of identity, my homie. The knight exclaimed, loudly. The cafeteria background noise died down as the entire population slowly turned their heads towards the kitchen. Yeah. Astolfo grinned, completely ignorant to the growing feeling of bafflement spreading throughout the room. Let's get to it, my peep. Boudica stared at the two before she leaned towards Archer and whispered to him, I feel as though I've witnessed something quite embarrassing. Archer let out a snort in response. Shaking his head, he couldn't help but agree with her on that point. Garcher and Big Sis Boudica have arrived. And we move on to the preparations for the Moon Festival. But it won't be for another chapter, because next time we're gonna focus on the humans of Chaldea. That and well, Boudica is gonna need to interact with Gareth obviously. But yes, as you might have noticed, the By the Bonfire chapters are slightly shorter. Mainly because there really isn't too much going on right now. Yeah, we've got a decent-sized roster so far, but we don't have the kind of servants who put together two big events and stuff. We'll get there though. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. Chapter 48. By the Bonfire, IV. By the Bonfire, Beneath Titans. Ritska's eyes fluttered open as he felt himself coming around to consciousness. He groaned as he moved his left hand up to his forehead and clasped it. Another of the freakish dreams again. He'd started getting them just after France, but they hadn't been too great of an issue because they mainly seemed to revolve around Chaldea. Then he started getting weird ones in places he'd never seen, like some weird graveyard, and more recently it had moved into some nasty forest. As he made to move himself fully, he found that his right side felt heavy. As if something were holding onto it, he then felt a tickling sensation beneath his chin as if it were resting on something. He got a sinking suspicion that he knew what it was, although he desperately hoped that it wasn't the case. Although knowing his current streak of luck, it wasn't likely. His head turned to look down as best he could, soon finding himself staring down at a mop of teal-colored hair lying on top of his shoulder. He froze and felt his heart rate quicken and the blood slowly rise up his face. He was certain he had locked the door before he went to bed. Which apparently had done very little to stop his new visitor from entering and making herself at home. Much as it somewhat freaked him out. It didn't look like she was awake, therefore he could probably still escape if it were capable. He slowly raised his free arm to gently clasp Kiyohime's shoulder and lift her up just enough so that he could slide out from underneath her. Unfortunately for him, it simply wasn't to be. He got about halfway out from underneath her before the berserker's head snapped up and he found himself staring into her brilliant golden eyes, which were entirely focused on him with an almost crazed gleam to them. Somewhat fitting for Madness Enhancement X, he supposed. Swallowing the lump in his throat, he attempted to greet her as best he could. Gee, good morning. She stared at him in silence for long enough that he began to feel uncomfortable before she eventually gave him a warm smile which positively oozed affection. Good morning, Anshin-sama. She replied back to him. I see you were attempting to get out of bed without disturbing me. Was my sleeping face that wonderful for you to see? She then giggled, while maintaining her grip on his right arm, because yours was. I couldn't help myself when I saw it. Really? He chuckled nervously, scratching the back of his head and looking away from her. He really hoped his discomfort wasn't showing that much. I've never seen it, so I wouldn't know. He almost cringed at the sentence, although Kiyohime giggled softly and reached up and stroked his cheek with the back of her hand. Of course not, Anshin-sama, that is a privilege reserved for only the closest to you. Her smile grew as her eyes positively glowed at this point, and I feel very privileged. He had no doubt she did. The problem was that he didn't. He very much didn't, and he wasn't sure how to break it to her in a way that didn't involve setting her off. He didn't know that much about her legend, but she seemed like that kind of person to get passionate about certain discussions. Her more recent discussion about raiding Ash's box for wedding rings honed it in for him. He didn't think she was malicious, at least not completely. From what Roman had explained to him, it was a manifestation of her madness enhancement which made her slightly more focused on her romantic attraction towards him. Can I? He coughed into his hand awkwardly, trying his best to give her a confident smile so as to not appear as freaked out as he felt. Can I get some privacy, so I can get changed? Why? Huh. There's no need for secrets between us. She smiled up at him with such an innocent expression, and a secret is just another form of lying, isn't it? And you wouldn't lie to me, would you? He felt as though an icicle had been rammed down his back at the way her eyes suddenly glinted with what could only be described as murderous intent. Not directed entirely at him, more towards the idea of lying. No. He shook his head rapidly, feeling sweat start to build up on his brows. It's just that there's, customs to think of. And I'm not mentally prepared. All of which were true. He was quite young, and although he was technically of marriageable age in Japan, he wasn't in Japan right now. He didn't think so anyway. He didn't know of too many places which had snowy mountain tops in Japan. There was also the fact he'd never had a girlfriend before, or boyfriend for that matter. He didn't judge, he just hadn't found himself that interested in people until recently. More concerned with his studies and whatnot. Although, perhaps it was puberty that had made him more aware of girls. He found himself a little caught off guard at times at how cute Mash was. He wasn't going to go there. Not with Kiyohime in front of him. She stared at him for what felt like hours, as if trying to discern his intentions. Soon, she released his arm and narrowed her eyes, flashing a fan into existence and hiding away half her face much. They remained that way for a few more moments before she eventually snapped the fan shut and gave him a wide smile. Of course, Anshin-sama. It wouldn't do for you to be too nervous when we eventually get married. I'll give you as much time as you need. She paused for a few moments before whispering out to herself, just not too long so as you are snatched away by Homewrecker. Before he could even think to respond to that, she swiftly go up and made for the door to his room. He could feel his heart rate return to normal. Then the door opened up and he found himself paling again. Olga stood at the entrance, winding herself up to knock on the door only to blink in surprise as it opened up. She soon frowned and looked down to see the berserker dragon girl staring up at her in slight surprise before her expression shifted into a suspicious frown. Olga knitted her brows in confusion at her appearance before looking over the girl's head and staring at Ritsuka. A silence filled the room as she stared at Ritsuka, only just getting out of bed and not having the opportunity to put a shirt on yet. Wearing only a pair of boxers to protect his modesty. The blood drained from his face as he followed her gaze behind him and in the direction of the bed, where the sheets were still somewhat messy from his rather hasty escape from the berserker. You have a magecraft lesson in 1 hour. Her voice came out in a flat, almost disappointed tone to his, which struck him like a bullet to the heart and almost had him recoiling. Clean yourself up before then. She scrunched up her nose, and the generators are not that badly damaged to warrant this. Before turning away and walking down the hallway, leaving Ritsuka to stew in his own embarrassment. Wait. He called out, rushing to the door and into the corridor. It's not what it. He found himself paling for the second time today as he came face to face with Astolfo. The writer stared at his semi-exposed form for a few moments, then looked over the top of his head to see Kiyohime leave his room, sending one last smile in his direction before walking off in the opposite direction. Astolfo remained silent for a few seconds, before a giddy expression came onto his face and he was soon shaking on the spot. Ooh. He let out a squeal and rushed over to Ritsuka, getting right into his personal space, with an ear-to-ear grin stretching across their own face. Master. I'm so proud of you. He cheered, throwing an arm over Ritsuka's shoulder and drawing him into a side hug. You've begun your conquest already. I wonder if you now have a skill called dragon laying. Get it? I can't wait to tell everyone about this. He felt his life slowly end before his eyes. Truly, there were some fates far worse than death. Coffee. Olga ordered as she approached the countertop. Black. She added on soon after, getting a raised eyebrow from the archer servant stood there before an uncaring shrug as he moved to the kettle. You look like you've got something on your mind. Archer remarked as he filled the kettle up, soon boiling the water and making his way over to where they kept the coffee beans. The director huffed in response, my mind is where I'd like it to remain, but you should know your master is a third-rate magus. For some reason that brought a wry smile onto Archer's face, as if he was laughing at some inside joke. Is that funny to you? No. He shook his head, looking over at her with a bemused expression, but you don't sound too aggrieved by the situation. I would be if it weren't for that fact I have my own servant. She replied, sounding far too smug than the situation actually called for. It wasn't like she could help it, even if they were a golem, her berserker was proof that she could actually do it. Even if her ray-shifting capabilities were brought about by extenuating circumstances, it nevertheless confirmed in her mind that she could do it. Ho! Archer hummed in response, impressive, so which one is it? The large suit of armor with the big axe. She replied. Archer nodded his head in reply, grinding up the coffee beans as the kettle soon began to steam. I believe I heard that one was a golem of sorts, yes. She flinched at that, so he'd heard about it. Just because it didn't really have any sort of will to argue with her didn't diminish her achievement in the least. She was still a master and that was what mattered. Still, I imagine they are an ideal servant. Huh. She furrowed her brows at him. He sounded sarcastic but there was an underlying tone of honesty in the remark. In what way? Servants like myself aren't all that different from you. He pointed out. Yes, we are glorified familiars, but we have our own minds and our own thoughts on how best to handle a situation which might contradict yours. He gestured to her hand, where the command seals in the shape of a falling star lay. That's why those exist. You likely never need to use one of those on your servant in order to ensure an order is carried out with absolute compliance. Olga squinted at him in mild confusion, scanning his expression for any evidence of sarcasm. However, his expression was perfectly straight. No evidence that he was being sardonic or making fun of her in any way, shape, or form. He didn't even sound insulted. No, I suppose I won't, she muttered, tilting her head slightly. You seem to have a decent understanding of how magi think for an archer. Do I? He responded, the wry knowing smirk made its way back onto his face. How odd. Maybe I'm just good at reading people. He gave a helpless shrug which definitely didn't feel genuine to her as he poured out the hot water into the mug. Who knows? The flat look she sent his way indicated that she didn't believe him being ignorant in the least. Unfortunately, there wasn't a lot she could do about it beyond ordering candidate Fujimaru to order him to tell her. Which, while it would certainly solve this particular issue, wasn't worth wasting a command seal over and wasn't a priority at this time. Fine. She huffed in response. Archer snorted at her defeated look and placed the coffee in front of her, but I've got my eye on you. I'm sure you'll be most diligent. He chuckled wryly. She held the mug up to her lips and blew on it slightly to cool it down before she took a quick sip. Freezing on the spot before she sighed, oh. Do I not meet your high expectations? At this point I'm wondering if we'll summon a servant who can't cook. She replied dryly before a slightly teasing smile came to her face. Besides, Sigward's tea is more impressive considering he can't taste anything. The way Archer's lip twitched slightly at the jab made her feel a little victorious in that moment. So what's got you looking so tired? Archer changed the topic, avoiding the mention of how he so clearly lost to her in a verbal spar. Is my master's third-rate nature getting on your nerves? Well, he's already at the tantric ritual stage it seems. Archer's eyebrows slowly climbed up his brow in mild surprise before they then knitted together. Really? She hummed in response. I didn't even need to teach him that one. Oh. Jealous are we? Gura. She almost spat out her coffee onto the desk, leveling a heated glare in the grinning servant's direction. Absolutely not. She hissed at him, and I'm more than grateful that certain other servants aren't here. Hound and heat following after you. Thankfully no. She huffed. Although he's taken to calling me something stupid. Honestly, the only people who show me respect around here are candidate Fujimaru and Mash. Not your doctor. Archer quizzed with a curious expression. She shook her head in response with a frown. He's scared of me. She dismissed easily with a lazy wave of her hand. That and I'm not sure being respected by him is a good thing. She paused for a few moments before she sighed. No, he's incompetent but he's not a bad person I suppose. I'm sure he'll be very touched by your compliment. Came the witty retort from Archer. Olga's lip twitched downwards in response for a few seconds before her lips thinned out. So my master isn't a complete hack, then is he? Oh no, he is. She replied instantly, didn't even know what a leyline was when he first came here. So we're having to run him through the basics. Her head dropped into her left hand while her right tightened its grip around the handle of her mug, and that was before we got the logic of some other world involved. No help on that front. Not really. Olga let out a weighty sigh. Our only real source of information if the divine spirit we have roaming the halls and he's not exactly too forthcoming with information. Either him or the blacksmith but he's already confirmed he wasn't that affiliated with sorcery beyond making mystic codes with it. A blacksmith who makes mystic codes. Archer blinked, raising an eyebrow at her. You don't sound too pleased about that. Oh, normally I'd be very pleased. She scowled in his direction, if we had anyone who could use them. Despite how good they are, their effects are apparently very simple. You hit something and it catches fire, or electrocutes them or apparently poisons them with curses. Were you expecting something more? Archer asked. She sighed and shook her head. From a blacksmith? No, not really. She shrugged, taking another sip of her coffee. He's good for what we need him for I suppose. Tapping her chin with a single finger, her expression turned contemplative, although perhaps if we had a caster who specialized in making golems. Archer, for his part, remained silent as he watched some of the other servants shuffle into the cafeteria. He got a slight wave from one or two of them which was honestly more than he was expecting to get. Although Sigward seemed to greet everyone equally and Astolfo just appeared to be slightly insane. I suppose we can use them with a golem crafter. Olga affirmed to herself, it would definitely be a slight boon to any singularity we go to in the future. Good day, Sir Archer. Sigward's boisterous voice called out to him. Both he and Olga looked over to the grinning man as he approached the kitchen. Archer nodded to him in greeting. Lady Olga, you're looking healthy as ever. Olga, for her part, stared at the man for a few seconds before she replied, thanks. In a somewhat confused manner at whether he genuinely meant it or if it was a backhanded compliment. The way his smile brightened indicated the former as he moved around the counter and into through the side door into the kitchen. By the way, were you able to find the ingredients you needed? We've got everything we need. Archer affirmed to him, were you able to look over the recipe I wrote out for you? I was indeed. Sigward boasted, I only hope I can live up to everyone's expectations. Somehow I'm sure you'll manage. Archer chuckled to himself, turning back to see Olga staring at the pair in mild confusion. Is something wrong? Not really, just curious as to what you are planning. She replied, it is still within my purvey to be made aware of all major goings-on in Chaldea, you know. She crossed her arms in front of her chest and assumed a defensive pose. Are we running low on supplies? Hardly. Sigward shook his head, giving her a reassuring smile. Myself, Sir Archer and Her Grace Boudica. Her Grace. Archer snorted out the title. You didn't say that to her face, did you? Well, she is a queen, isn't she? Sigward responded with a mild frown. Is it not proper respect to address her by her official title? Archer let out a huff of amusement and shook his head, looking back to Olga. As he was saying, we were making sure we had enough supplies for the Moon Festival celebration that was being put on. Quote. There's a Moon Festival celebration. Olga knit her brows together, her eyes darting between the pair. Why wasn't I informed of this? You weren't. Sigward looked genuinely surprised at her. I assumed that Roman had. Romani. She scowled. So this was his idea, was it? Going above my head and trying to spread joy and goodwill amongst the staff. Archer finished for her. Yes, she glared at his smirk. I am simply upset he didn't ask permission first. She composed herself, speaking in a much calmer tone. I would have had no issues with it. Archer hummed in a not quite disbelieving tone, but it was still more than enough for her to let out a huff. If it please you. Sigurd brought her attention back to him. I believe he was going to ask permission, he merely asked us to prepare in the event that you did give permission. That was actually sensible. It meant there would be no time wasted in sorting through all the necessary steps. That and giving the staff a small break wasn't exactly out of the question as things stood. They had just solved 2 singularities back to back without much rest, and there wasn't any further luck in locating the next one as of yet. Fine. She eventually relented, sounding more tired than annoyed. You can continue with your preparations. I'll inform Romani, if he remembers to ask me, that I've already given you permission. How magnanimous. Not a word from you. She shouted at Ash as he made a drive-by comment, only overhearing the latter part of the conversation. The unkindled gave her a somewhat lazy wave in response, causing her eye to twitch. She sighed and turned back to see Archer and Sigurd looking at her in equal parts amusement. What? A frown soon came to her face. What's so funny? Nothing. The pair responded, Archer sporting that insufferable smirk while Sigurd held only an innocent smile as he turned away and moved further into the kitchen. She didn't like those expressions on either of them for some reason, as if they were laughing at some hidden joke. It's not that funny. Romani lamented as his head was clasped in his hands. The smirk he got from Carrie indicated that the woman didn't believe him in the least. You sure? She teased, because your girlfriend thought it was hilarious. Romani leveled a flat look in her direction. Don't joke about that. Da Vinci would never let me hear the end of it if she caught wind of it. Ah, wise man. Maxwell nodded his head sagely, as if he was about to impart some grand words of wisdom. Romani knew him better than that. Keeps your options open. If she makes it official, then you can no longer go fishing for other catches. Really? Carrie leveled a dour look in his direction. I would say men, but I can't actually complain too much. Is there a problem with Da Vinci, though? Munier span his chair around to face the others, a thoughtful look on his face. She seems to like you well enough, and she's pretty. Romani stared at the man blankly for a few moments. No. I don't think I could look at Leo that way. I think. He suddenly sounded unsure of himself. No. Wait, no. He shook his head. Even if I did, there really isn't any time for that kind of thing. You sure? Carrie smirked. Way I see it, this is actually one of the best times alive for it. She crossed her arms behind her head and leaned back into her chair. Quick job so you don't need to worry about attachments and all that. Am I being advocated on participating in one-night stands? Maxwell asked incredulously. Carrie barked out a laugh and slapped herself on the knee. What? You're telling me that there aren't any that take your fancy? Well, my wife might take issue with it. Maxwell quietly muttered out. Carrie's expression froze before slowly receding into a more sympathetic one. Right, yeah, she quietly mumbled out, looking away from Maxwell. Sorry. No, that's my bad. He sniffed, shaking his head before coughing into his hand. Still, I'm surprised to see you talking about this kind of stuff. Didn't do that before. Didn't have hotties around Chaldea before. She replied with a smirk before she turned back to Romani. So, you and Da Vinci? No. Romani shut her down, looking back to the monitor at his desk. And besides, is it really appropriate to talk about people when they aren't in the room? Who says they aren't? Romani leapt out of his chair and span around when he felt cold air tickle the back of his neck, grasping at it in a panic only to let out a sigh when he saw Da Vinci's grinning face staring back at him. Romani. Da Vinci whined, how cold. You were all having a gossip session without me. Carrie blinked at her and exchanged looks with Maxwell and Munier before turning back to the genius. Well, if I knew you were interested I would have invited you, although it's always bad form to intrude on another Magus's workshop. Da Vinci pouted in response. Is it because it doesn't have a door anymore? That still isn't fixed. Munier blinked in surprise. I thought it would have been by now. Yes. I intend to have Ash fix it, considering he broke it. She grumbled out. However, it got me thinking that if we are going to have more servants here, it would be best to strengthen the current environment of Chaldea. You mean like reinforce the walls? Maxwell span in his seat so he was facing Da Vinci fully. We can do that. Don't underestimate a genius, Da Vinci sang while placing her hands on her hips. I can do pretty much anything. Except fix your door within the span of a week apparently. Romani whispered, only to freeze when Da Vinci leveled a not-so-playful glare in his direction. I mean, I'm sure you're taking your time to make sure it's perfect. He corrected himself, relaxing slightly when her glare abated into a pleased smile. Whipped. Carrie coughed into her hand, then pat her chest slightly. Sorry. She grinned innocently at the doctor, must have had something stuck in my throat. Romani gave her an incredulous look before he sighed and shook his head. In any case, probably not a bad idea to reinforce Chaldea if we get some servants who are temperamental, or can just damage the facility by simply moving. Or both. Da Vinci frowned, still complaints about Havel. He cornered Vincent yesterday. Munier piped up, caught the man trying to examine his weapon. That just sounds like stupidity then. Da Vinci's frown turned into a tired look. We put out that warning that he didn't like mages. You know what Parhope family is like. Munier sighed. Study of elementals and phantasmals, then he gets a man wielding a dragon bone as a club, surprised it took him this long. It's also dangerous. Romani pointed out. I need to speak with Fujimaru-kun to try and get Havel to at least tolerate the magi around the base, considering that almost everyone left as one. Why not just use a command seal? Carrie suggested with a shrug, tell him to just leave everyone alone. We don't know how effective his ability to cancel magic is. Da Vinci replied this time, he could very well remove the compulsion of a command seal. Could we, just? I don't know. Carrie muttered, then looked at the pair, send him back. Romani and Da Vinci grimaced, we'd rather not do that. He responded after a few moments, in truth, we really do need all the help we can get and he hasn't done anything actually violent yet. But he could. Maxwell crossed his arms with a thoughtful look on his face. He might very well be a ticking time bomb and if someone else like Vincent sets him off again. I'll speak with Fujimaru-kun. Romani nodded to them, see if we can't do something about him. I'd rather not have it come down to an ultimatum but if he does threaten the safety of Chaldea. We should probably discuss such things with the director first. Da Vinci opted in, she is still in charge so it would ultimately fall down to her. Do as you will. Carrie grunted, spinning her chair around, I just man the coffins. I'm sure we can come to some compromise. Munier pointed out, the divine spirit managed to talk him down. True, but Gwyndolin rarely leaves his room. Romani pointed out, although Astolfo seems to be able to hold some sway over him. You mean assign him as a babysitter? Maxwell cringed in response to the image in his mind. As did several others in the room. Let's put that idea on hold for now. Romani nervously chuckled. At the very least if we can keep the other magi away from him there should be no problems. Yeah, that's all well and good. Carrie sighed, but his master is also a magus. Not a very good one by any stretch of the imagination, but still a magus nonetheless. Romani flinched in response, sharing an uneasy look with Da Vinci. Havel's first impression of Ritska had been poor to say the least, however despite that the berserker had yet to do anything to actually jeopardize the safety of Chaldea beyond scare a few mages by glaring at them. Therefore Romani couldn't recommend any course of action beyond simply asking Ritska to keep a closer eye on them. However, Carrie did make a good point. Fujimaru was a magus, one of the types of people that Havel evidently didn't like. It could lead to a number of issues if he was to try and work with him in a master-servant relationship. He could only hope that Ritska could build up a good repertoire with the servant. Hey everyone. The cheerful voice of Astolfo had the room jolt in surprise before they turned to see the pink-haired rider bursting through the door and into the command room, an ecstatic grin on his face. I have excellent news. He paused for a few moments before his expression turned sly and he let out a giggle. Or maybe I should say sexcellent news, hey. The room stared at him in silence before Da Vinci broke it, giving the rider a patient smile while holding a slightly amused twinkle in her eye. So. What's this news? Master isn't a virgin anymore. Wah. And he's gonna spread it all around Chaldea, Ritska lamented into his hands while Mash pat him on the back in a reassuring manner, her own expression a mix between sympathy for her master and mild annoyance at both Kiyohime for sneaking into his room in the middle of the night and Astolfo for running off after misunderstanding the situation. What am I supposed to do? He looked up. Mash also turned to their conversation partner. Vrindari's helmet perfectly hid his expression away. The man's form was rigid to the extent he could have passed as a statue. Unfortunately for Ritska, that was exactly what Vrindari wanted to do at that exact moment. I have no idea how to answer this, was the singular thought running through his head. He didn't have much experience with women and court gossip. He spent most of his time as a squire and then as a knight. His duty to the kingdom often took him away from these sorts of interactions. But I don't want to disappoint my liege either, was the other unfortunate thought running through his head. My liege, he hesitantly began. He trailed off, unsure of what to say. His hesitance wasn't missed by either of them and Ritska's head fell into his hands before he let loose another pitiful whimper. Perhaps you need only explain it as a misunderstanding. Really? Ritska sniffed, looking up with a hopeful expression. You think that will work? It can't hurt. Vrindari replied, honestly, I believe that the fellows of Chaldea are of the mainly reasonable sort, my liege. He clenched his hand and thumped it into his breastplate, and if need be I will be sure to stamp out all rumors of fornication. Thanks. Ritska tilted his head and looked to Mash in slight confusion. I'm sure it'll be fine. You're probably right, senpai. Mash cheered, giving him a reassuring smile. I'm certain that once you explain it to everyone, then they'll understand. Fujimaru-kun. The intercom loudly cut off what she was going to say as Romani's rather frazzled voice called out through it, Fujimaru-kun, would you please come to the infirmary right away? Ritska blinked looking to the other two in confusion. Wonder what Roman wants. Maybe he just needs to check up on something, senpai. Mash replied, although she didn't look too sure of it either. You should probably go though, the doctor might get a little bit more panicky though. Yeah. Ritska pushed himself to his feet, giving the pair one more smile. Thanks you too, I'm sure I'm getting all worked up over nothing. Worry not, my liege. Vrindari gave a shallow bow of the head. I would allow no slander against you, and neither with Squire Kyrillite. Mash blinked at being addressed before she turned to Ritska and gave a determined nod. All right. I won't let people tell lies about you, senpai. I appreciate it. Ritska gave a light chuckle as he waved to the pair, soon opening up the exit from the training room and closing it behind him. The door to the infirmary slid open as Ritska approached it, the boy opening his mouth and beginning to speak as he entered. So what did you need me for, Roman? Ritska cut himself off when he saw the doctor stood behind the desk, Da Vinci next to him with a positively cat-like smirk on her face. The man had a chart behind him which made Ritska slowly feel the blood leave his face. Your servants and you, a guide to a safe physical relationship. I'm surprised Leo was even able to make this so quick. Romani mumbled to himself before clapping his hands together and turning to face Ritska with a non-judgmental look. Okay, Fujimaru-kun. Astolfo kind of already told us but I feel it best to, are you alright? It's all a misunderstanding, Ritska whined into his hands. Kiyohime snuck into my bed. I didn't do anything to her. Oh. Roman replied after a few moments, then gave a sigh of relief. That's good, for a second I thought you might have taken advantage of Berserker's madness enhancement. Ritska snapped his head up to almost glare at the man. Romani raised his hands in surrender. I did say almost, you probably aren't the sort of person to do that. I'm not. He grumbled before shaking his head. Did you call me here just for this? He gestured to the whiteboard. Romani nodded in response. So because I didn't do anything, can I go? Nope. Da Vinci sang, earning an odd look from Ritska and a slight cringe from Romani. Just because Astolfo was mistaken doesn't mean we don't need to address this. Her smile grew wider. It means we're gonna have to cover tantric rituals. The only thing she got in response was a slightly confused look from the master. What's a tantric ritual? Tantric. Da Vinci corrected, then frowned. How far have you gotten in your lessons with the director? She was explaining elements to me. Ritska replied. Da Vinci blinked. Ah, so you're still at the basics, more or less. She remained silent for a few moments before she shrugged, giving a slightly more enthusiastic smile than normal. Then we're just gonna have to skip ahead a few steps to teach you this stuff. But the director told me to. Up, up, up. Da Vinci cut him off while wagging her finger. Romani's expression slowly turned to one of horror. Don't worry about a thing. It's really very simple. Oh, Ritska blinked in response before raising an eyebrow. So it's going to be a quick lesson. Well, that sometimes depends on the person, Romani sputtered while flushing. Ritska gave the man an odd look before slowly turning his attention back to Da Vinci and narrowing his eyes in mild suspicion. He could feel a slight sensation of dread creeping up his back. All right, he slowly replied. So what do you mean? Sit, sit. She gestured to the seat while moving over to the whiteboard. Now, the first thing we need to discuss is how magical energy exists within living things. Olga sat at the table in the library with a mild scowl on her face as she continued to tap away at her desk. Her eyes traveled up to the clock on the wall, the sight of which only forced her scowl to grow in intensity. The door finally opened and the object of her irritation slowly crept through and towards the table. You're late. She snapped at him, which would have earned a slight flinch were it not for the slightly perturbed expression on the young man which indicated his thoughts were elsewhere. When I told you to come here within the hour, I expected you within the hour. It has been nearly 2. Ritska at least had the courtesy to look guilty as he slowly fell into the seat just in front of her. Sorry, director. He bowed his head in apology. I had to clear up a misunderstanding. I'm not interested in your excuses. She cut him off. You should be grateful that I've taken the time to even entertain teaching someone like you. In fact, you should be positively enthusiastic that the head of a mage family is personally having to explain the basics of magecraft to someone of your position. Quote. Da Vinci was explaining something to me. I just told you I. Da Vinci. She tilted her head and raised an eyebrow at him. What on earth could Da Vinci possibly need to explain to you? Quote. Tantric rituals. Why would she? She slowly scrunched her face up. You mean you weren't even aware the ritual existed before you participated in intercourse with your servant? I didn't. She snuck into my bed. His head dropped onto the table. I even locked the door. I was in the process of getting her to leave when you showed up. Quote. Oh. She managed to resist the slight cringe from showing on her face at the misunderstanding on her part. I see. Well, she coughed into her hand. That's. I appear to have made a wrongful conclusion. Quote. That's a weird apology. She bristled slightly. Well, sorry. She snapped at him in response. What exactly were you expecting? I'm not saying anything is wrong with it. Ritska reassured her, looking slightly worried about her reaction, just that it was a little weird. He sighed. Unfortunately, Astolfo found us after you left. I think all of Chaldea thinks I slept with my servant now. They're mages. She dismissed. They will likely dismiss it as simply a transfer of magical energy. They'll think little of it. Olga paused before something suddenly clicked into place. Was this why Dr. Romani summoned you to the infirmary? Ritska slowly nodded in response. Da Vinci decided to give me a lecture on tantric rituals. He shivered. She tried to give me a pamphlet as well. Olga opened her mouth to reply before she snapped it shut, knitting her brows together and raising a single finger. Where did she get the pamphlet? I don't know, Ritska replied with a shrug and a bewildered expression of his own, although at least Romani would say he'd do what he could to correct people's misunderstandings. Well, your somewhat bizarre and fanciful excuse aside. Olga went on. I shall forgive you this one time for being late, however do not allow it to happen again. She narrowed her eyes at him and leveled a finger at his forehead. Understood. Yes, director. He nodded back to her with a determined expression. She stared at him for a few moments longer before giving a satisfied nod. Now then, continuing on from the elements, magi all have an affinity towards a certain one which forms the basis for their own magecraft. And a little chapter which focuses more on the people of Chaldea and the otherwise non-servants' main staff. And some slight hints as to the explanation of magecraft which Ritska didn't really get in the Grand Order story. Anyway, next time we're moving into the first proper event. You've seen the build up over the last 2 chapters with mentions of the dumplings, but we're going there in the next chapter, which will probably cover about 2 or 3 chapters in total.